Greetings, friends. Juan Ningruska here, and this is the weekly Russian-Ukrainian War update for the week of February 5th through 11th of 2024. And this week we have a ton of updates, and I mean a ton. This is probably the biggest changes in the war in a long while. Now, there's not a big aerial offensive. It's not like the entire front line collapsed, but this is the biggest. A lot of updates have happened, and it literally started as soon as I finished making my video last week. So we have a lot to talk about. And the focus of this week is in Avdiivka. And if you guys haven't been following the news, this is a bit of a big change than what we saw at the end of last week. As you can see, so basically what happened this week is that the northern defense of Avdiivka has collapsed. Now, when we used to talk about the north, we thought about this area, but we're not talking about the flanks. We're talking about the north of Avdiivka itself. And when it comes to that, the defenses in the north of Avdiivka have basically collapsed with the Ukrainians. How did this happen? You know, how have the Russians captured basically the northern part of Avdiivka for the most part, excluding the coke plant? Let us begin from the start, and I will go step by step what happened. What happened was that after the Russians had been pushing south through these Avdiivka dachas during the month of January, and basically the Russians were going house to house, slowly using the buildings as defense, for defensive purposes, and slowly moving across these dachas in the north right here, using this reservoir as a defense in the on their western side. However, they also have captured this filtration station. They also have, so this area they had good flanking support with this area, and so they were able to move all the way south to this area right here. And basically what happened was, and we mentioned about how we saw Russian troops in this area. However, what happened right after that happened, was that since the Russian troops are already, in this area in the south of Kamyanka, and since the Russian troops reached the end of this Avdiivka dachas, this place in the middle, right to the north of this, what I call the Avdiivka Lake, this area right here completely collapsed. The Ukrainian troops that were holding this area, they're like, well, our flanks are completely exposed. We're going to fall back. And that's what happened. Basically, this northern front completely collapsed. These two tree lines completely, they all fell back. The Ukrainians fell back to the northern part of Avdiivka, and then they fell back to these two strong points right here, which we'll talk about in a bit. So anyway, the Russians were able to collapse these two areas and entered the northern part of Avdiivka. Now, the thing about the Ukrainian defenses here is that the Ukrainians didn't have much defenses, thinking they're going to defend the attacks from the north here. They're building their defenses in the south because, like, hey, the Russians are right here. They're going to push up here. So the Ukrainians, their defenses here are naturally inclined towards a Russian push from the south towards the north. However, the Ukrainians did not expect the Russians to attack from the south down this way, because it's like, well, we don't expect them to attack from the backs here. And because of that, and because attacking in the residential area is a lot more safer than attacking out in the fields, the Russians have been able to collapse this northern area. So what happened was, once they entered the northern part of the residential area of Avdiivka here, they entered this area right here first. They entered along Zilizhansha Street, I can't pronounce this for shit, and around Stepova Street, so this area right here. And so they entered this area in the beginning of earlier this week, and then basically for the rest of this week, we basically saw a slow collapse of Ukrainian troops. So within like 2 or 3 days, the Russian troops managed to reach what they call Donetska Street right here. And basically, after they reached this street, they reached a critical junction point. So, at first, this wasn't too bad. It's like, okay, this is horrible that the Russians entered Avdiivka, the residential area of Avdiivka, from the north. However, there's still, it's not a complete collapse of the strategic situation. However, once the Russians reached what they call the railway bridge, this area right here, and we know the Russians have controlled this bridge because the Ukrainians were shelling Russian troops here, and there was also, I think, a sign that said something about the Donetsk People's Republic here. So, obviously the Ukrainians wouldn't put that up there. So the Russians reached and captured this critical railroad bridge here. The capture of this bridge along this railroad basically was very precarious for the Ukrainians because now that and once the Russians cross this railway bridge, this is where we are at the end of this week. There, before we continue talking about the Russian progress in the north of Avdiivka, you need to understand two roads. One road is the Industrial Prospect Street. This is one of the main. This is what connects the northern defenses of Avdiivka in the coke plant specifically to the southern defenses of Avdiivka, in the south here, because obviously this road connects these two. And the second one that you need to know is this smaller road from Servina towards the 9th High-Rise District. However, what's happening is that the Russians are basically pushing to slice Avdiivka in half. And basically, for the most part, by the end of this week, while it's not completely confirmed yet, basically the Russians have are only like 200 meters, 300 meters from cutting this road in half. The thing that was that right now the battles are clashing. There's two places you need to know about: the Avdiivka car depot, this area right here, and this building right here. This building doesn't really mean much. This is called, I think, something about the limited liability company or something, some company building. This is not too important. The capture of this basically opens up a jumping off point for the Russians to enter the Avdiivka coke plant from the south, because taking this area allows the Russians to attack the coke plant from the south here. They obviously have positions to the east of the coke plant already, and from obviously, while not as secure, they could also attack the Avdiivka coke plant from the north. So once while this is probably going to be the last battle for Avdiivka to take the coke plant, the Russian troops are in a good position to start storming it from 3 positions once they are in a better position to do that. However, while that's important, what's most important is this area right here. The Russians are captured most of the Avdiivka car depot, and they are consolidating their positions. And basically, if it's true that once they consolidate in the Avdiivka car auto depot, as you can see, there's nothing else that stops the Russians from capturing the Industrial Prospect Road, which is the main road of life for Avdiivka. And once Russian troops are basically on this area, physically cutting it, so the Russians are probably going to are right now trying to storm this limited liability company building right here, this little business. And once this is captured, they'll probably start advancing and try to capture these few buildings right here, and basically capture, basically be along this, physically cut this main line of retreat for the Ukrainians. And once that happens, which will happen, and basically has already happened, Avdiivka will be split into 2 parts. The northern defense of Avdiivka, basically just center on this coke plant, and the southern part of Avdiivka, which is very precarious because while the north is relatively could still be supplied in other ways through Orlovka, that is not true for the southern part of Avdiivka. And there is one more line, though, one more road, but this is under direct Russian fire control. And so basically, there'll be only one way to escape after they get cut off from supply, and the Russians just could continuously bomb any supplies or any retreats, and thus the Ukrainian commander are in a very precarious situation. Along with this, the Russians are pushing south. So while the main focus has been to cut the main road of life and cut the city in half, the Russians are also moving south here. They've captured the Avdiivka beach right here, along with this lake area. So they've continued advancing south along Peremyska and Stepova Street. And rumors have it that they are now reaching the outskirts of what they call the Avdiivka railway station right here. And one thing is the Ukrainians are using this railway line along with the 9th district with these high-rise buildings as kind of like, hey, we want to hold this railway line as like a defense point, because defending on the railway line is easier for the defenders to defend on, and the high-rise buildings gives them a local high-rise a high ground basically. And so along with this, there's a lot of better buildings. There's a hospital here. There's a few bigger buildings here than there are just regular houses. And so the Ukrainians are trying to, don't want the Russians to take the railway station, the main station, because then they could just advance, flanking them, and then this whole defense line collapses. And the reason why the Ukrainians want to keep this along, let me go back to my Twitter thread, which I made here, right here. So if you see on this Twitter thread with this black line right here, this goes along the railway line. This basically, if the Ukrainians decide to fall back, they could give up, this area of Avdiivka, the residential area in the central part of Avdiivka and in the south. And then if the Ukrainians can make a fighting withdrawal, because then they could just continuously, slowly fall back along this main road, because even if this road is cut, they could just retreat back along this area, and basically not envelop, if they stay too long and they don't fall back, then Ukrainian troops defending, for example, in these strong points in the filtration system, further south toward, in this area, in this what they call the sand quarry, this area right here. This is another area that the Ukrainians are defending. You could see the some trenches here, for example. So this area right here, and there are still Ukrainian troops there. But if the Russians keep pushing, and cutting them off, then they'll be in a cauldron basically, and this will be a big blow to Ukrainian morale. Basically, not only will they lose the city, it's worse enough that they lose the city, but to lose the city and thousands of Ukrainian troops, that is very bad. And so, the Ukrainian clock is ticking. They need to make a decision. Do they counterattack to try to, keep the Avdiivka story alive, or will they have to do a fighting withdrawal? If they do a fighting withdrawal, they're going to withdraw to this railway line, to the high-rise buildings, and to the coke plant. If they don't, then there's only one other option, which is a attack on the flanks and to keep putting troops into the grinder here to stop the Russian advance. So, and I actually also have it here, right here. These little arrows. One thing I'll mention about along with this about Avdiivka is that Russian troops the Ukrainian command has fired, or Zelensky, I should say, has fired Zaluzhny. Now, I was going to talk about this at the end, but I guess I have to talk about it now because it kind of makes it puts into context what I mean about the Avdiivka counterattack. So, as I mentioned, they could either double down and put more troops into the cauldron and throw troops into an offensive operation that is suicidal, or they could fall back and give up Avdiivka slowly. However, the reason why I do not see that, one reason why I think they might counterattack, in fact, I think a lot of Telegram posts have said, yes, they actually are planning on doing a deblocking operation, is because the new commander-in-chief that has replaced Zaluzhny is Syrsky. Syrsky was the commander of Ukrainian ground forces in Bakhmut, for all Ukraine, but he was specifically in command of Ukrainian troops in Bakhmut. Now, the reason why, and a lot of Ukrainian troops do not like him, is because when the Wagner troops last year encircled Bakhmut from three sides, exactly in the same situation the Ukrainians are out in Avdiivka, then he still put troops into Bakhmut to keep getting pulverized, and they're like, this is literally useless. We go in there, we are cut off from supply, we keep getting bombed, and not only that, Syrsky spent a third of the Ukrainian counteroffensive to try to take Klishchiivka and Andriivka, which took a few months. But the whole point of this was to take Bakhmut back, and for in exchange of losing, thousands of troops to take two villages, he wasted a bunch of highly elite ideological units, and that's why a lot of troops don't like Syrsky. Zaluzhny, well, he cared about the troops. He was a Ukrainian patriot. He really understood, I support saving troops' lives over minor tactical, wins. Okay, maybe if I sacrifice a few thousand Ukrainian troops, the Russians will be delayed in taking this village for another month. But the Russians taking this village doesn't necessarily complicate the whole defense. I'm not gonna. Manpower is more important than a certain village or a tree line, and especially if it's not that. As we saw that, despite yes, the Ukrainians delayed capturing allowed the made the Russians take 2 or 3 more extra months to take Bakhmut. But in exchange for that, they lost, probably 10,000 extra soldiers to keep that, to keep getting thrown into this cauldron after after the Wagner troops surrounded it on 3 sides. And as we saw, the capture of Bakhmut did not lead to the fall of Chasiv Yar, did not lead to the fall of Konstantinovka and so forth, or the fall of Donbass. Like, all it did was basically prolong the inevitable, and in exchange for just 10,000 extra, probably 10,000 more Ukrainian troops to die. Like, it was useless. And Ukrainians are like, hey, there's only a certain amount of us, and we're not going to, we could fight, but we can't, if you want us to fight for every single piece of land, and not only that, to counterattack, which is even a bigger load on their on their situation for manpower, they're like, that's really risky. But since Syrskyi says, I don't care about your lives, I'm going to send you out to attack to gain minor tactical victories, and I'll keep you, I'll keep throwing you into the cauldron. Zaluzhny was more like, okay, we'll fight, but if it becomes a situation where we're going to lose anyway, I will pull the troops out to support their lives so they could fight another day. So since Zaluzhny was fired because he was too popular, Syrskyi is in charge, and now that he's in charge of Avdiivka by default, he's going to do these counterattacks, even if the Russians will destroy these counterattacks. And since they're, if you're in this position, imagine Syrskyi's like, hey, the troops are getting pummeled in the filtration system. I need you to move, let's say you're Ukrainian in reserve here, ready to, in this area, and they're like, hey, go right here. And you see this on the map, you're like, well, why the hell would I enter this area? I'm about to be cut off. Look at this map. And Syrskyi's like, I don't give a shit. You will go into the cauldron, and so and be eaten alive and be cut off from supply. So, I think that's why the Ukrainians will attack. They will try to deblockade. They're not going to just withdraw from Avdiivka. They will fight to the last Ukrainian, and they will try to deblockade. The main offensive is going to be focused here. They're going to try to take Krasnogorivka and this Tarakhan, the main dominant hill in this area, and because if these things fall, let's say the Ukrainians are successful, then the Russian troops advancing in the north of Avdiivka will themselves be mostly cut off, and the advance in the north will probably stop. And this will also deblockade Avdiivka from the north, and they'll probably do a smaller attack to the south here towards Vadana and Opana to put less pressure on one of the main supply roads to Avdiivka here. So that is the situation in Avdiivka. The Russians are getting closer to these 2 defense points. They are expanding towards cutting the city in half. No real changes in the south. However, the Ukrainians basically lost a lot of their reserves here trying to do counterattacks after the Russians took the Tsar's hut in this area right here. So that's Avdiivka. The Russians are putting a lot of pressure. They are cutting it into pieces. This is like Bakhmut again. And so that's the situation in Avdiivka. It took a little while to explain, but the Ukrainian situation here is precarious. It is not a matter of if, but when Avdiivka falls. And we shall see what Syrskyi has in mind to sacrifice. Will we see Avdiivka fall by the end of this month, basically, if progress continues as it is, and and the Ukrainian command slowly retreats, or will we see Avdiivka take another 2 or 3 months, but in exchange for a couple thousand more Ukrainians dying for little gains in fighting for the last man and doing counterattacks that just delay the inevitable? We shall see. So that's what's happening in Avdiivka. Now, again, the whole point of this whole Donetsk operation here is to push the Ukrainians back to what I call I don't call it that, it's what it's called, the Vochachka River here. And this is where the Ukrainians are making their new defense line. And the Russians want to push them here because then the Ukrainian artillery will be back here, and the conventional Ukrainian artillery back here won't be able to shell Donetsk city. And so that helps deblockade Donetsk, for example. Well, Donetsk isn't blockaded, but it's right on the front line, and the Ukrainians were able to shell it with impunity. We saw a lot of terror shelling here, and pushing them back here to the Vochachka River will prevent the Ukrainians from shelling Donetsk with conventional artillery. So that's what the whole Avdiivka operation is about. but not just Avdiivka and other parts. So let's talk about the South Donetsk direction. Let's talk about Peremyska, for example. Now, Peremyska is kind of part of the Donetsk in the part of the Avdiivka operation, in the sense that this helps support the how would you say it, the southern defense of Avdiivka, because again, they want to encircle Avdiivka from the south, but they need to secure their flanks to the west, and they need to take Peremyska for that, but also to take Peremyska to push the Ukrainians away from Donetsk. And so this week, the Russians have taken the southern part of Peremyska. A lot of troops are saying that the center part of Peremyska is still under Ukrainian control, but this road, the Pereshtronovivka road, that leads until it goes to the center, is under Russian control, because this excursion basically was since the Russians are already in the north here, and this was basically a very hard to defend area, and so the Russians have been able to take this southern part of Peremyska, and the Ukrainians are now in the center part. And so, again, this is another part to secure the flanks of the southern part of the Avdiivka operation, but also to keep pushing Ukrainians further back from Donetsk here. So, however, the Ukrainians still have a lot of good positions in the center of Peremyska, so we'll see how the Russians continue to develop their operations in Peremyska. So far, they've captured this area, and right now the Ukrainians are kind of basically in this area right here. This is where the Ukrainians right now try to hold back the Russians. If we continue going down to the South Donetsk direction, the Russians are also on the offensive here. Again, from Marinka, the purpose is to push the Ukrainians back away from Donetsk to stop them from shelling it. If we look at actually the Rybar map here, if we look here, let's go here, we could see that in Grigorievka, is that the Russians have basically secured themselves. A lot of maps are showing that along this reservoir. So these little houses along the reservoir, up to the end of it, is under Russian control. However, the center part of Grigorievka is under Ukrainian control. So it's kind of like another inverse. It's like the same as the Peremyska situation. The southern part of Grigorievka is under Russian control. This map, under Syriac map, says this area is still under Ukrainian control, but as we can see from Rybar, this area is under Russian control. However, on the north here, from this map shows that the Russians have controlled the northern part of this area. So the Russians are pushing along this reservoir to take Grigorievka. Again, to push the Ukrainians away from Donetsk. Now, there's 2 points for this. There's the short-term winter goal, which I think is to reach this reservoir right here, which means capturing Grigorievka, because not only will this allow them to flank Krasnogorivka, which needs to be taken to push the Ukrainians away from Donetsk as well. This will basically allow them a springboard to continue their push towards the Vochachka River. However, this also helps in tandem with the more southern part of the South Donetsk area in Novomikhailivka, which is where we'll start again. So the Russians have captured, another chunk of Grigorievka and are continue pushing along these fields to reach this reservoir and to continue pushing the Ukrainians back from Donetsk. So they basically reached the end of this canal. Not only that, they have restarted operations to reach Novomikhailivka, or to capture Novomikhailivka. There was a surprise Russian operation that allowed them to capture the eastern outskirts of Novomikhailivka right here, as you can see. And not only that, the Russians also started a southern offensive operation to enter Novomikhailivka from the south. So they recaptured the cemetery right here. I want to see if they recaptured the cemetery. And they are basically in the southern part of Novomikhailivka here. The eastern part is under Russian control. And the Ukrainians are getting bombed heavily in Novomikhailivka. So while the center is also part of still under Ukrainian control, the eastern part is under Russian control. So kind of like the same thing as Peremyska and Grigorievka. But this is incredible pressure. The Russians are using heavily FAB bombs, these unguided bombs, or guided bombs, I should say. And basically completely destroying every defensive point of the Ukrainians in the village, and this allows them to capture these more easier than they could have before. And so Novomykhailovka is the Russians have finally entered this village, and Ukrainian counterattacks have not been able to dislodge them. While this village is not taken just yet, now that the Russians are entering Novomykhailovka, it's only a matter of time before this falls. And the main Russian goal is to capture this village of Konstantinovka right here. The capture of this village will basically allow to cut off one of the main supply routes, as you can see along this highway, to Ugledar, which is one of the main, the capture of which will give the Russians operational space to basically for this entire area right here, up until this area right here. So Ugledar is a major objective for the Russians. They tried to capture it over a year and a half ago, or a year ago, but they failed. So, but that was because they didn't take the flanks of Ugledar. And so right now they need to capture Konstantinovka to cut off Ugledar, but also this secures the flanks of Russian troops trying to advance towards Kharkova, which is another major Ukrainian defense point here. However, if the Russians keep advancing along, these villages, right, there's still Ukrainian positions right here. And so if they don't advance here, but they advance here, the Ukrainians could use this area to attack the Russians on the flanks. So if they want to expand any more from Grigorievka towards this village, I can't even pronounce it, but as they advance, this will make them into like a salient, and they won't be, they'll be attacked in the flanks. And so they need to expand this way so they could continue helping the flanks of the Russian positions in the that are advancing towards Kharkova here. So the Donetsk front is the most hottest front. The Russians are encircling Avdiivka. The Russians are pushing towards Kharkova. They are advancing into Novomykhailovka to cut off Ugledar. And one of the main goals, I think, of the Russian winter push, as I name it, is to push the Ukrainians away from Donetsk. So that's what's happening in the Donetsk front. A lot of progress for the Russians this week. Let us now go towards the Bakhmut front. And before I start, let me get let me drink some water here before I begin. I love water. Anyway, let's begin with Bakhmut. The Russians have actually restarted in a surprise assault. The Russians took what they call the Popovsky Forest. The Popovsky Forest is this area right here. This is in a hill with a forest, and basically the capture of this forest allows the Russians to not only basically this is one of the main points of defense that helped. Right now the battles in north of Bakhmut are dependent on the fields here. Now, taking Bogdanovka, taking Ivanivska here, these areas are kind of not as important as the defense nodes and strong points in the fields in the outskirts of these villages. And so the capture of these outskirts of defense nodes are what is being fought over, because if the Russians take it, then the Russians will be able to take these villages. For example, taking the Popovsky Forest was one of the main areas the Ukrainians were holding to defend central Bogdanovka in the southern part of it. However, before the Russians could take the center of Bogdanovka, they need to capture this forest right here, which is still under Ukrainian control. So the capture of this forest is, once this forest falls, there's nothing stopping the Russians from taking the center of Bogdanovka and basically capturing this village. And again, the purpose of this operation is to push towards the Sovietsky Donetsk Canal here and basically reach Chasov Yar. Now, not only does the capture of the Popovsky Forest cut off the southern part of Bogdanovka, or at least threaten the southern defenses of Bogdanovka, it also threatens the northern defenses of Ivanivska. So as we can see right here, the Russians, because of their operations here, have basically entered or are on the outskirts in front of Ivanivska. However, there's a lot of Ukrainian defenses in this area, So the Russians, with the capture of the Popovsky Forest, allows the Russians to get towards the northern part of the Ivanivska. So not only will the Russians be able to attack Ivanivska directly from the east, they'll be able to attack it from the north. And this two-pronged attack, if the Russians are able to do that, will basically allow them a better time to take this village. And not only if Ivanivska falls, which is the center of all Ukrainian operations on the eastern edge of this canal, if Ivanivska falls, then Ukrainian positions in Klishchiivka and Avdiivka will basically collapse. They will be forced to withdraw to the other side of the canal because this is where the Ukrainians defend Klishchiivka and Avdiivka and try to do attacks to slow down the Russians in Klishchiivka and Avdiivka. There's been no real progress for the Russians here. They've been trying to capture these hills in the north of Klishchiivka, but with little progress. However, if the Russians are able to expand their positions out of the Popovsky Forest, which they'll be able to now because the Popovsky Forest is in a high ground, they'll be in a good position to take Ivanivska by storm on two areas. And if this area falls, they'll be able to take Bogdanovka. And let's say once Bogdanovka, Ivanivska falls, there's basically nothing stopping the Russians from reaching the canal, which is the goal of the Bakhmut operation. So we'll see if the Russians could expand upon their gains in the north of Bakhmut. And then also the capture of Ivanivska would collapse Klishchiivka and Avdiivka. So we'll see how that develops. The Russians are making a lot of progress in Bakhmut. Some progress in Bakhmut, but we'll see how the Ukrainians could hold. Further north towards the Seversk front, we're actually going to talk about Bilogorivka, which we haven't talked about in a while here. The Russians have managed to capture what they call the filtration system right here. This was basically the industrial zone of Bilogorivka. You can see it's completely raised to the ground. They also took the hills right here to the east of Bilogorivka. However, Bilogorivka itself is in the lowland here. So the Russians could storm Bilogorivka and take it if they wanted. However, the Ukrainians are in a good position here. The Ukrainian the main positions aren't in Bilogorivka. They are in this hill right here, in Grigorivka right here. And these hills, you can actually see the trenches here that they're so defended here. These trenches are what you can actually see this trench right here, or is this a trench? It might be a ridge. But anyway, this is a hill. This is basically, if the Russians enter Bilogorivka, they're going to be in a low ground while the Ukrainians are in the high ground here. And so thus, Bilogorivka is basically kind of in a gray zone. But again, so in order to take the hills here, the Russians have to continue their offensive operations in the Seversky Donetsk forest, because then that allows them to flank this hill. And then with the capture of this hill, that's when they could finally secure Bilogorivka and secure the Luhansk Oblast for good. However, the capture of this filtration system and this filtration industrial zone and the hills here give them a good position to assault Bilogorivka directly once they're able to take this hill. So a lot of progress here. I like this area because it shows you the extent of damage. Like, this is the actual how the front looks like. Like, if you look at old maps, this is like, you see all these, you say, oh man, look at all these buildings, there's nothing stopping the Russians, but then it's like, wow, look at all these, you can see the trenches and the destruction here. You can see it all around here, and that's the actual situation. Like, you might like, wow, look at this industrial zone, like, this must be a good place to secure yourself, but look at this destruction here. So I kind of like this area because it shows the true extent of how the front looks like. So Bilogorivka is kind of like a symbolic thing because the Ukrainians are holding on to it because it gets say, hey, we're still in Luhansk. Luhansk is not completely gone. But for the Russians, they want to take while they are in control of like 98% of Luhansk Oblast, it's still kind of a bit of a threat. It's kind of annoying for them to not have the last 1 or 2%. So Bilogorivka is getting pressured, and so forth along. As we know, there's also pressure here near Vasola. So the Ukrainians and Severodonetsk are not, they're not in a peaceful situation. They are still on the defensive here. If we're going to go to the Luhansk front, this area of the Oskol front, two things to mention. The Russians are still putting pressure on Ukrainian troops and they're advancing towards Tyranny. There hasn't been as much progress as in the last week. However, there has been some progress. They're still advancing along these like tree lines right here. They moved a few hundred meters here, so they're still pushing here. And they are trying to reach Tyranny and Yampolovka to reach and capture the eastern bank of the Zhirbets River. And basically, once they reach Tyranny, they're able to advance north and basically continue attacking on two sides, Ukrainian positions all along the eastern edge of the Zhirbets River. So that's what's happening there. Nothing. It's not like the Ukrainian positions here have changed dramatically. It's just that the Russians are pushing here. They're making some progress. That is what's the goal of the Russians, to reach the end of to reach the Zhirbets River, which will give them a good defense point. Give me a second. Sorry. I need some water. I'm speaking a lot today. Anyway. So, they need to reach Tyranny and Yampolovka, and the Russians are slowly but surely getting closer and closer to these villages. And this is just another area the Ukrainians have to defend. Another thing to talk about here, if we go further north towards in the Kupiansk front, they call it, or because it's near Kupiansk. A lot of sources are saying that the Russian commanders that were in charge of this area of the front are sacked. And good riddance, because those commanders were complete dog shit. They've been trying to take Sinkovka for a while now, and for months, and there's been no progress on the northern part of Kupiansk. And so they changed the generals, and lo and behold, they're like, hey, why instead of attacking Sinkovka directly, why don't we try to flank it? And lo and behold, a small change in tactics allowed the Russians to enter the northern part of Sinkovka and take it. And so while the village is not taken just yet, we'll see how the new Russian commanders could improve their positions here. So in Sinkovka, because the capture of Sinkovka is necessary to continue putting pressure on Kupiansk. So we'll see if the new tactics from the Russian commanders will lead to any sort of breakthrough here and stop the stagnation in the northern part of Kupiansk. That is the Oskol front, so pushes in the Zhirbets River, pushes towards Kupiansk. So pressures are all over the front here. Not as much progress this week as compared to the Donetsk front, but the Luhansk front is still getting pressured and still has some progress. That on the other parts of the front, there's been no real changes in what I'm calling this borderlands region, because it's the borderlands between the Donbass and the Zaporozhye front. This is the border right here. So in this area, the Russians are still improving their positions. Northern Prudnia trying to basically reach this these lakes right here and this river to just get a good defensive position. There's been no real changes in the Zaporozhye front. It's kind of positional battles. The Russians are trying to get towards the outskirts of Robotyne in the south and west. They are pushing the Ukrainians away from Verbova, but the Ukrainians are still holding on to this salient. There's not major changes. The Russians are pushing, the Ukrainians are holding, but no major changes in the Zaporozhye front. In the Kherson front, the Russian troops are trying to clear the Ukrainians away from Krinky. However, to fully clear it, it's very hard because the Ukrainians have a strong drone presence and a strong artillery presence on the other side of the Dnieper River, which anytime the Russians try to fully clear Krinky, they get attacked. So basically, what the Russians have been doing for the last few weeks, and the same this week, is to basically have a small position for the Ukrainians in Krinky where they send their 100, 200 Marines here. The Marines hold this area, and they just get bombed and shelled and droned, and the Russians just kind of stay back and just bomb them to death. Basically use this as a meat grinder. So neither side can, the Russians can't fully clear Krinky, the Ukrainians can't develop on their offensive operation on this side of the Dnieper River. But the Russians can't necessarily kick them all out. So, same thing as has been for the last few weeks in Krinky. So, I talked about the situation with Zaluzhny and Syrskyi and everything. Zaluzhny also got fired because he was very popular with the troops, and he could have challenged Zelensky, and Zelensky obviously does not want that. The Russian winter push continues. That is what, this Russian winter push, is going to continue for another month or two. We'll see how that goes until the spring mud comes. But, so the spring mud's going to come, and the Russians still have some time. They are pushing everywhere. The Ukrainians are running low on manpower, on shells, on just basic military equipment in general. They have lower morale because they realize, oh shit, we're not going to automatically win. We're gonna, this is an attritional war, and we are losing. And what's the reason why we're fighting? So while Ukrainians are still holding, they're still fighting back. It is a very tough time for the Ukrainians, and the Russians are making a lot of gains in this winter push. So that's the end of this video. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I know this was a long one, but there's a lot of progress this week. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Give it a like, comment your thoughts, share this video around, and if you want to see videos more similar to this one, please consider subscribing to my channel. It's I have a lot. I keep doing weekly videos like this, informing you guys, and I hope you guys enjoy my commentary and my my info, so you guys keep me informed on what's happening on the front. So that's the end of this video. I hope you guys aim high and wander on.